Hello and welcome to the latest Endangered Wildlife webinar focusing on the benefits of integrating biodiversity valuation with your environmental management system. My name is Ian Finch, Product Portfolio Manager at Regal Smart Solutions, and I'll be your host for the next hour as we hear from two leading experts in the field of biodiversity finance and environmental management. Our opening speaker is Shana Gavron, CEO of Endangered Wildlife. She's currently completing her fourth master's degree in wildlife biology and conservation. This in addition to her qualifications in business management, finance and wildlife management. Shana is also an associate of IEMA. I think it's fair to say that Shana is more than qualified to talk about the benefits of performing a biodiversity valuation and the metrics she and her team use to calculate each valuation and produce a final financial report. Following on from Shana, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Russell Burton, Director at Hillside Environmental Services, who will discuss how an organisation can get the most out of their environmental management system. Both speakers will discuss integration in more detail and the benefits that can be gained by doing so. We would really welcome all of your questions, so please do pop them into the questions tab at the bottom of your screen. And after we've heard from both speakers, I will put as many as I can to Shana and Russell in the time we have left. One final piece of housekeeping, the webinar is being recorded and can be viewed via the registration link for up to 6 months from today. The link can be shared with colleagues who might also want to retrospectively watch the webinar. So now I'd like to hand over to Shana, CEO and founder of Endangered Wildlife.
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. Well, as Ian said, my name is Shana Gavron, and I'm the CEO of Endangered Wildlife. And we at Endangered Wildlife have developed a way to value biodiversity. We've developed the means that allows us to actually calculate a specific financial value of an individual species of biodiversity in a specific location. And where we've taken a slightly different approach in this webinar of ours this time is previously we generally focused on the concept of how we value biodiversity and how it works. But this time we really want to demonstrate the application of it by taking one of the case studies that we've done with the Everglades National Park, where we actually valued 10 different species. But before I do, I'd like to actually just recap how exactly we value biodiversity. So the valuation approach is quite a complex and in-depth way. And I'm going to ask you now to try and just remember the colors in this diagram, because we use these colors going forward for each of the valuations that we bring out in more detail. So it's easier to identify and locate once you've got an idea of how the colors work. So when we do a valuation, we've tried to take into account as many different options of values which allows you to actually understand the specifics of a species, because ultimately every species is very different. And what we've tried to do is standardize the approach, and by standardizing it, we try to encompass all possible valuations to allow that flexibility to come in. So firstly, we bring in data, lots of data when it comes to both environmental and economic data. We then look at carbon value. This is something that is specific to the species, and some species have a carbon value than others. For example, your trees, your mangroves, your seagrass, they offer much higher levels of carbon sequestration and thus carbon value than something like a small herbivore. We then look at our aesthetic value. This is a traditional value, but we've taken it slightly one step further by looking at both a real aesthetic value and a virtual aesthetic value. Then we move into our economic values, up to 28 different economic values, which are dependent on the species we are looking at. So, for example, where we will go into more detail with the mangroves, the economic value includes insurance, it includes tourism, and it also includes the fish nurseries. We then take it to the hedge value, which is ultimately a willingness to pay to make sure that that population we're looking at is sustainable and healthy. So that means that we're keeping it above minimum viable population, because below that we're going extinct. And below the carrying capacity, above which we become destructive, similar to what we're facing with humans at the moment. These come together to form our species existence value, which is similar to your present value in financial terms. We then calculate our impact value. Now, the impact value looks at a 30-year scenario if you were to properly manage or support that population, and how that ends up impacting all the other species in the same habitat and any other exogenous variables such as your climate change. These come together to form what we call the total conservation value, which is more like your future value in finance. But when we actually start referring to the total value or the value of a species, this is the number that we are actually referring to. And like I say, in this presentation, we're actually going to discuss a case study we did for the Everglades National Park, where we took the 10 different species shown in this picture, and we valued each of them. So that includes the birds, trees, reptiles, mammals, and fish. And we will be going into more detail, in particular on the American alligator, the American crocodile, and the red mangrove. So let's start with the American alligator. This species in particular is currently considered least concern. However, there are a significant number of threats that it faces, ranging anywhere from property developments all the way through to climate change. So it's quite exposed to both human and natural related threats. Within the Everglades National Park, there is an official estimate of about 200,000 individuals. Now, bear this in mind when we start looking at the next slide, which is the average individual value. Because when we carry out a valuation, we tend to carry it out on the population and average it out for an individual. So a population that is higher tends to end up being a lower individual value, and a population which is lower tends to have a higher individual value. And I'm bringing this out because you'll notice, especially when we compare the American alligator and the American crocodile, there is quite a vast difference. So how much is an American alligator worth? Well, we know it doesn't really contribute much towards carbon, but there are tourists who are interested in actually seeing the alligator. That is what's generating that aesthetic value of 366 euros. It does also contribute towards the economic value, which again is relating to your tourism value. The hedge value isn't that high, partly because I would say it would probably be a fairly stable population that we're looking at. And the impact value, that is actually taking into account to make sure that we keep a healthy population of alligators. But overall, essentially, we're saying that about 3,442 euros is being contributed to the economy, to the society, and to the environment as a result of one singular alligator. Now, this is why I say come back to the idea that there are 200,000 of them. So actually, the entire population is contributing about 688 million euros to the economy, which is quite a sizable amount just thinking about one particular species. Comparatively, if we're to look at the longest snouted American crocodile, we see a slightly different story. Again, it's at least significantly smaller population with only 2,000 estimated in the Everglades National Park. But again, it is exposed to human and natural threats. But when we start looking at the actual evaluation of one crocodile, and this is why I say again, it depends on population sizes, you'll see a significantly higher value, where actually it is generating a total value of over 43,000 euros. But taking into account only 2,000 of them, so actually they're contributing towards society, economy, and environment approximately 87 million euros. But that's not a small amount either. So you can start to understand or get the idea of how much these species are actually contributing to the state of Florida. Now comes the more interesting and compelling case, that of the mangrove. Now, we've looked specifically in this situation at the red mangrove, which covers about 39,000 hectares. Although it's only a least concern, normally when people start thinking about mangroves, you automatically think of the idea of carbon sequestration. And there's a lot of stories out there saying that the mangrove forests have a much higher capability of sequestering carbon than even the Amazon forests. And this is why there's so many projects happening whereby people are reforesting the mangroves. So what we did, we looked at a potential 30-year carbon contract based on the voluntary market prices, and that would give a value of about 105 million euros. Sizable, more than a crocodile, but we do not see the mangroves being purely carbon. They are worth so much more. They fit within their ecosystem. They fit within the human ecosystem. For the human ecosystem, people are interested in seeing the mangroves. And also indirectly for the human system, the mangroves play a critical role for the fish nursery, for fish nurseries. And for fish nurseries, ultimately that's going to affect things such as fishing and recreational angling. So all of these things actually have to be factored in when you consider the value of a mangrove. So what happens when we actually start to consider these other factors? We already know we've established a carbon value of 105 million euros. But if we start to look at everything else, you've got aesthetic value, okay, still small at 3 million, but there's an economic value or economic contribution of 78 million euros. This comes in heavily with things like the fishing industry. The hedge value starts to play a more critical role because essentially it is a critical species, and there is going to be more willingness to support that population, make sure that population is a safe or healthy, sustainable population. The impact value also starts to rise because of the fact that it is so interconnected with all the other species around. It is critical for those fish. It is critical for the birds. It is critical for the entire ecosystem. So this actually means that you've got a total conservation value of 277 million euros. Now, you think about that, that is more than double, significantly more than double the value of just the carbon. And this very much emphasizes why it's necessary to take into account carbon plus. And here we are taking into account your carbon plus. And that is what we really want to emphasize, is this is the whole greater benefit of looking at more than just the mainstream values. So just to go through some of the other species, I'm not going to go into exact detail of each and every one, but to get an idea of what these species are actually worth. And you think about how many species there could be in the Everglades National Park, you start adding all of these up, and it is a significant contribution, which is why we also argue that there should be more than just an ecosystem service for the entire ecosystem itself, and that each species does play a role. And it's important to understand the value and the importance of that individual species within the entire network. So actually our highest value on an individual basis belongs to the barred owl, with a value per individual of over 2 million. But again, it comes down to, you could say slightly, actually an estimated only 9 individuals in the Everglades National Park, which takes the total value, which is the value we actually calculate, to about 20 million. The lowest value, besides the alligator, but out of the other species, is actually the snook at just under 6,000 per individual. Now, it's estimated that there's a little more than 43,000 individual snook, and that takes the total value to 257 million. So small on an individual basis, but significant on a total basis. And this is mostly as a result of the economic value, which exceeds on its own over 200 million. So you can just start to grasp the significance of the species for the economy as a result of heavily your recreation and your employment. Now, you might say, so what? Why do we actually want to understand this? Why is this important to me as an individual, as a corporate, as an investor? Now, the way I like to think about it, we essentially have a decision tree. For example, and this relates, I think, very much well with the Everglades National Park, with Florida, with the idea of property developments, clearing out all the wetlands, putting in all the mangroves, putting in nice construction, be it a commercial or residential construction. Now, you have this choice. If you're going to do this development, you essentially can choose, clear everything out, displace all the biodiversity. You're going to lose effectively all the benefits from the biodiversity there. You've got the cost of clearance, you've got a cost of maintenance, and ultimately you are increasing your carbon footprint. And with everyone wanting to reduce carbon footprint, essentially by clearing it all out, it's opposite to what you want. The second option is effectively to integrate that development with the national park or with the mangroves, with the alligators, with the entire ecosystem. You don't need to keep it totally wild, but you can keep part of it wild. By keeping it natural, you ultimately are reducing your costs. You don't need to clear it. You're reducing your possibly flooding risk because you've got a natural insurance by the breaks that the mangroves are creating. You are reducing your carbon footprint. And at the same time, you essentially are telling your investors, you're telling your consumers, you're telling your stakeholders, all the different stakeholders, that you actually are doing something green. You're not just greenwashing the story. You're actually being able to demonstrate the fact that you are integrating nature in a positive way to your benefit and to the benefit of society and to the benefit of the economy. And this is where you start to be able to see what the benefit is of being able to understand biodiversity and understand the valuation. And biodiversity is a very complicated subject. Environment in general is a very complicated subject. By being able to provide you with a monetary value, everyone understands money. Regardless what sector you're in, regardless what country you're in, a dollar is a dollar. A euro is a euro. People can relate to that. People don't need to be re-educated to understand that. So being able to value biodiversity in a financial sense allows you to begin to communicate this to your different stakeholders. You're allowing yourself the ability to speak to your management, speak to the entire team, your investors, your directors, and say to them, we are making this decision because of this. You can start taking this into account in your cost-benefit analysis. Is the blue decision cheaper or more cost-effective than the red decision? That is more of a traditional decision that you're making. At the same time, there is this shift towards biodiversity reporting. I know in Europe, for example, with the SFDR, you've got to start reporting. There is actually mandatory biodiversity impact reporting. This allows you to take that step further and say, yes, we're having a positive or negative impact, and actually this is how much it is, and this is how much we need to offset. At the same time, for your investors, you're able to say, well, I'm investing in this company. What is my impact? Well, now you've got a number. You can start to use a traditional metric. You can start to say, this is actually my impact return on investments. It's also a way that you can actually start to assess who's giving a donation. Have you given a donation? Has a company given a donation? How effective has that donation been? So it all allows you to start to take into account all these factors of what is the cost, what is the benefit, what is the risk, and start to use it in a very, very quantifiable manner that you can understand, that everyone can begin to understand without that need of what does this index mean, what does this metric mean. So I'd like to leave it on that note, let you try, absorb, think about it. What and how would you actually want to incorporate biodiversity? Is it something that's a challenge for you? Because this is the easiest way for you to actually do it. It's an easy way for you to understand, this is what the biodiversity means to me. This is how I can incorporate biodiversity into my life, into my decisions, and into my business, and ultimately into my investments. And on that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.